Have you ever wondered what a woman is capable of when every boundary she ever respected is shattered in a single night? The Chronicle of the Iron Duchess does not begin with triumph or crowns, but with a silence so heavy that even her enemies recorded it as the moment the world shifted. Before her vengeance changed the balance of an entire realm, she was known as a strategist, a ruler with an iron reputation. Yes, but also a figure who still clung to certain unspoken limits. What no one foresaw was how fiercely those limits would collapse, or how quickly her name would evolve from respected noblewoman to a force whispered with fear in corridors of stone. Imagine entering a fortress where tapestries hide the bloodstains of forgotten rebellions. This was the environment where the Duchess learned to read betrayal the way others read books. Her childhood shaped her into someone who understood power not as a privilege, but as a fragile structure maintained only through vigilance and calculated cruelty. Yet, even with such a background, those closest to her claimed she possessed something unusual for her era, a sense of restraint. They said she punished strategically, not impulsively. She built alliances instead of destroying them. But the night that would reshape the entire kingdom tore that restraint apart, with a precision almost too cruel to be coincidence. Some historians suggest that what happened to her family was orchestrated by a council of rival lords. Others propose an underground sect, desperate to eliminate her influence. None of the theories fully capture the intensity of what followed. There were no public proclamations, no dramatic speeches, no overt threats. Instead, the transformation began quietly, in the locked chambers of her ancestral keep, where she spent 3 days without emerging. When she finally stepped out, those who saw her claimed her presence felt altered, as if she had returned from a battlefield no one else had visited. The Iron Duchess was no longer operating within the realm of conventional political retaliation. Something far deeper, darker, and far more calculating had awakened. Records describe her walking through the Great Hall with an unsettling calm, her gaze lingering on faces that had sworn loyalty yet could not mask their unease. She did not confront them. She did not question them. She simply watched. And in that watchfulness, something terrifying was born. The understanding that vengeance executed, slowly, invisibly, and without mercy, could reshape a kingdom more profoundly than any open war. What came next would shock even her most trusted allies, but the first signs were already there. In the subtle way she reorganized her guard, altered patrol routes, summoned old contacts from the shadows of the empire, and began acquiring information with a hunger that unsettled even seasoned spies. It was as though every memory, every humiliation, every betrayal became fuel for a plan no one else could fully see. And perhaps that is why her vengeance was so devastating. Because it did not begin with violence, but with silence. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt that moment when everything changes inside you? When restraint gives way to something sharper, more determined? Share your thoughts in the comments. Leave a like to show that this kind of story resonates with you, and check if you are already subscribed so you do not miss what comes next. Because what you will discover in the next moments may truly surprise you, and we are only beginning to uncover the shadow that followed the Iron Duchess. The silence that surrounded the Duchess after her 3 days of isolation was not the silence of mourning. It was the silence of someone reviewing every fragment of a shattered world and deciding which pieces were worth turning into weapons. The tragedy that ignited her transformation did not happen in the open, under banners or before witnesses. It unfolded in a place where loyalty was supposed to be unquestionable, her own ancestral court. And the cruelty of it was not only in the act itself, but in the precision with which it targeted the few vulnerabilities she kept hidden from the world. Her family, though small, had always been the counterbalance to the ruthlessness required of a ruler. They represented a part of the Duchess that few believed existed, a part that humanized her. Some chroniclers speak of a young brother, others of a son barely stepping into adulthood, and some even claim the tragedy involved a trusted mentor who had raised her in the art of governance. The true identity of the victim was obscured by time, but every version of the story agrees on one point: the attack was not random. It was executed by people who understood exactly how to wound her in a way no battlefield ever could. The night of the tragedy, the Duchess was away negotiating a treaty that should have strengthened her house. While she was reassuring nobles who pretended to be allies, assassins slipped through the stone corridors of her keep with knowledge that only insiders could possess. When she returned, the fortress smelled of burned oil and blood, though the bodies had already been taken. There were no survivors to question, no messages left behind, only a handful of signs that the attackers had moved with military discipline, suggesting the operation had been planned for months. What disturbed the Duchess most was not the death itself, but the realization that the betrayal came from within her circle. The sealed gate that had been opened, the guards reassigned at the last hour, the servant who vanished without trace the following morning. These were not the actions of distant enemies. These were choices made by hands she had once fed, trusted, or elevated. And if betrayal could thrive so close, then nothing in her realm was as solid as she once believed. While others in her position might have sought immediate retribution, the Duchess understood something crucial. Striking back too quickly would only expose how deeply she had been wounded. She had always believed that power required discipline, but now she embraced a new truth. Vengeance required patience. It was not enough to punish those who orchestrated the tragedy. She needed to understand the architecture behind it, the hidden alliances, the silent exchanges, the old grudges dressed as diplomacy. So she ordered the castle sealed, not out of fear, but to observe how people reacted under pressure. She paid attention to trembling hands, nervous glances, whispers cut short when she entered a room. She questioned no one, yet everyone felt interrogated. The fortress became a stage where every gesture revealed something, and the Duchess watched as if she were studying a map that slowly drew itself. Her allies began to sense a shift, but none dared to ask what she had discovered. The tragedy had not only broken her heart, it had sharpened her vision. Every ally now looked like a suspect. Every council meeting felt like a performance of liars hiding behind polite words. And in that suffocating atmosphere, the Duchess began crafting the first layer of a vengeance so meticulously designed that even those who supported her would later claim they never imagined how far she was willing to go. Her silence was no longer a pause. It was preparation. And as the days passed, the kingdom began to feel the weight of something moving beneath, the surface unseen but growing, like storm clouds gathering behind mountains before anyone notices the change in the wind. By the time the Iron Duchess emerged from her fortress of contemplation, her mind had already begun weaving a web no one could see, a network of calculated moves that would strike silently yet lethally across the kingdom. She did not rush into retaliation. There was no immediate show of force, no army parading banners in the streets. Instead, she began observing, recording and cataloging every interaction, every loyalty, every hidden grudge. Her vengeance was not impulsive. It was surgical, invisible, and terrifying in its precision. Each day, she summoned her most trusted advisors, though even they were not fully aware of the depth of her plans. Meetings were subtle tests, a misstep in phrasing, a hesitation in loyalty, a fleeting glance that betrayed deceit. The Duchess noted them all, her mind absorbing patterns like a spider mapping the threads of its web. Information became her weapon, a collection of secrets that no one could imagine she possessed. The smallest hint of betrayal was transformed into intelligence, and intelligence became ammunition for the psychological siege she was preparing. She extended her gaze beyond the walls of her own keep, reaching into neighboring territories where rival nobles whispered behind closed doors. Through discreet correspondence and trusted intermediaries, She began assembling a network of spies and mercenaries, people whose allegiance was bought not merely with gold, but with carefully curated fear and opportunity. Every hidden message, every coded letter, every seemingly trivial observation became a piece of a larger puzzle. Nothing was random, yet the outsiders could never perceive the design. By now, the Duchess had begun applying lessons she learned in the shadows of her childhood. Patience, timing, and anticipation. She understood human behavior not as it appeared, but as it could be, manipulated. The timing of her moves, the apparent accidents, and the meticulously orchestrated rumors were all designed to erode confidence in her opponents before she ever struck. Allies became uncertain. Enemies grew paranoid. Every action was a whisper in a growing storm. At night, she would walk alone through the halls of her ancestral keep, tracing the patterns of its architecture with her mind, imagining how she could control each corridor, each chamber, each secret passageway. She considered the psychological impact of every choice, the fear that would ripple silently through the council, the dread that would spread among rival households. Her vengeance was already underway, though invisible, like a shadow stretching across the kingdom before the sun even rises. It was in these hours of silent calculation that she discovered the most effective tool: ambiguity. By leaving traces without explanation, she forced those around her to question every motive, every gesture, every word. Would the Duchess strike today, tomorrow, or months from now? Which rival would be punished first? Which ally would be spared? The uncertainty itself became a weapon, making her enemies tremble without a single blow. Meanwhile, her reputation as the Iron Duchess grew quietly, but relentlessly. Couriers returned with tales of her vigilance. Spies whispered of her unseen reach, and rumors began to paint her as omnipresent and omniscient. By the time her first act of vengeance was executed, it was not a surprise. It was inevitable. Every subtle manipulation, every calculated observation, every silent threat had primed the entire kingdom for the storm that was about to fall. Through patience and cunning, she had transformed herself from a noblewoman seeking justice into a force that redefined power. And yet, the full extent of her strategy, the precise moment when her vengeance would manifest in ways that shocked even her closest allies, was still shrouded in shadow, waiting for the world to realize that the Iron Duchess had already set the board, and every piece was moving exactly as she intended. The first blows of the Duchess's vengeance were invisible to the untrained eye, but they struck deeper than any battlefield cannon. Her enemies did not fall in open combat. Instead, they vanished quietly, one by one, their disappearances marked by subtle signs that chilled even the most loyal allies. It began in the quiet hours of dawn, when the corridors of her ancestral keep were empty, and the guards, sworn to protect, became unwitting witnesses to orchestrated chaos. The Duchess understood that terror was not just physical, it was psychological, slow, deliberate, and, above all, methodical. Her initial victims were those who had plotted the betrayal, those who had whispered against her name in shadowed halls. There were no public trials, no proclamations of guilt. She preferred the ritual of uncertainty: a servant missing, a locked door unexplained, a sudden disappearance of personal effects. By the time the court realized someone was gone, the Duchess had already ensured that fear rippled through every household, every council, every noble ally who thought they were secure in her favor. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. Loyalty is not given, it is observed, and betrayal leaves consequences unseen yet inevitable. She utilized every tool at her disposal: poisoned letters, secret corridors, controlled rumors, and the manipulation of the most trusted servants all contributed to an invisible symphony of retribution. The elegance of her method lay in its invisibility. No one could accuse her of a direct act, and yet everyone who crossed her felt the weight of an unspoken punishment. Some of her enemies began to suspect one another, and in the cracks of their paranoia, the Duchess's influence only grew stronger. Fear became the silent currency of her rule, far more effective than armies or executions in plain sight. By the third week, the first of her calculated disappearances reached even the farthest provinces. Those who had underestimated her began reporting strange anomalies. Messengers arriving late with vague warnings, unexpected audits of estates, and mysterious injuries with no identifiable cause. She transformed her network of spies into instruments of psychological warfare, ensuring that even allies questioned the security of their own position. The Iron Duchess did not rely on noise or spectacle. She relied on the meticulous collapse of trust, the erosion of certainty, and the anticipation of every human weakness she had observed in the past months. And yet, it was not simply fear that she cultivated. Her enemies were meticulously manipulated, given opportunities that seemed like salvation, but were, in reality, traps. One misstep, a hesitant answer, a fleeting glance, a delay in delivering a message, was sufficient to seal a noble's fate. Every detail was deliberate. Every choice was observed. The Duchess had become a master of subtlety, a phantom moving through the lives of those who dared oppose her, invisible but unrelenting. By the time her first ritual was complete, whispers had spread throughout the court. The Iron Duchess was no longer just a noblewoman seeking justice. She was a presence, an unseen force capable of unraveling alliances without a sword drawn. And in the midst of this silent storm, she left a challenge for her observers. Who among you will act with loyalty, and who will falter when faced with the shadow of her vengeance? I want to know your thoughts. Which part of this silent, meticulous justice do you find most chilling? Leave a comment below sharing your reaction or a similar story of cunning and strategy you've encountered in history. Your insight matters, and your perspective helps unravel the layers of this shadowed world. As the first whispers of fear settled across the court, the Iron Duchess turned her attention to the shadows, beneath the kingdom. She understood that true power did not reside in the surface. It was cultivated in the hidden passages, the corridors forgotten by time, and the alliances unrecorded in official ledgers. Beneath the stone foundations of her ancestral keep, she established a network that would allow her influence to extend far beyond what anyone could observe. A subterranean web of spies, informants, and agents whose loyalty was forged in secrecy and terror. This underground network was not a mere collection of hired hands. It included former mercenaries, exiled nobles, and even disgraced scholars whose grievances had made them desperate for purpose. The Duchess understood that desperation, when directed skillfully, could be a sharper weapon than any blade. Each member of her covert assembly was trained to act with precision, to intercept messages, manipulate rumors, and ensure that every act of treachery or hesitation would be observed and recorded. She knew that her enemies feared the unseen far more than the visible. A dagger in the dark is frightening, but the knowledge that someone watches every movement, every word, every thought, that fear is inescapable. The Duchess herself rarely ventured into these tunnels, preferring to operate through intermediaries and coded signals. She would receive updates in encrypted correspondence or through subtle gestures during council meetings, each indicating the state of the network, the progress of her plans, and the vulnerabilities she could exploit. By maintaining this layer of separation, she became untouchable. Even those who thought themselves clever in hiding their intentions underestimated the reach of her silent eyes. The targets of this network were not limited to enemies alone. Allies, too, were observed, their loyalty tested with seemingly trivial assignments or obscure errands. A failure to comply, a delayed response, or a hesitant glance was sufficient to place a doubt in the Duchess's mind. Those who maintained trust found themselves elevated, while those who faltered faced subtle forms of intimidation, warnings disguised as chance encounters, rumors that spread like wildfire through the corridors of influence, and unexplained setbacks in their fortunes. Fear, as the Duchess had learned, was most effective when it was invisible, persistent, and impossible to pinpoint. Her adversaries began to notice a pattern, though they could not name it. Disappearances, miscommunications, and sudden misfortunes were not random. They were coordinated, executed with precision, and tailored to each individual's weaknesses. By the time someone realized the network was at work, the Duchess had already shifted her focus, ensuring that the next act of manipulation would be even more effective. Her enemies began to question not only each other, but themselves. Every word, every action scrutinized for hidden meaning, every decision shadowed by the possibility of unseen retribution. Even those in the highest echelons of power, accustomed to deception and intrigue, began to feel the weight of her underground strategy. The Duchess had created a parallel realm within the kingdom, one where information itself became a weapon, and the very knowledge of her presence could bend the will of those who opposed her. The subterranean network transformed the landscape of fear. Her enemies never saw her strike, yet each day felt like an encounter with inevitability. Every whisper, every shadow, every unspoken warning fed the growing legend of the Iron Duchess, whose vengeance was both invisible and unstoppable. When the Iron Duchess finally moved from subtle manipulation to open action, her first large-scale operation was unlike anything the kingdom had seen. It was not a battle in the conventional sense, nor a conflict announced by trumpets and flags. It was a carefully orchestrated massacre, executed with precision and timing so exact that even her closest advisors could barely comprehend its scale until the aftermath unfolded. Villages, fortresses, and noble estates that had harbored her enemies became the stage for her relentless vengeance, each act a calculated demonstration of power. The Duchess's strategy combined what she had learned from observing human psychology with the military precision she had cultivated over years of careful study. No single act was random. Every assault, every selective strike, was designed to create fear, confusion, and despair among her adversaries. Some chroniclers describe the events in terms so brutal that they border on legend. Entire households vanishing overnight, patrols discovering only smoke and rubble where towns once stood, and survivors spreading tales of a force so efficient, so inescapable, that it seemed supernatural. Yet there was a method behind the horror. The Iron Duchess ensured that the atrocities were not mindless. High-ranking nobles and leaders were subjected to public yet controlled punishment, humiliations, and executions executed to maximize psychological impact, to instill terror without losing the loyalty of those who remained. Peasants and minor officials were spared when they demonstrated compliance, but the consequences for dissent were immediate and merciless. She used terror not as a tool of random cruelty, but as an instrument of governance, a signal that rebellion, no matter how hidden, would be met with absolute certainty. The ripple effect was immediate. Entire regions began to bend toward her will before she even arrived. Messengers spread rumors of her precision and ruthlessness, and these whispers traveled faster than armies could march. Her enemies, accustomed to conventional warfare, found themselves unprepared for a leader who could calculate fear like a currency, distributing it where it would yield the highest return. The Iron Duchess transformed her vengeance into strategy, and strategy into dominion over the minds of her adversaries. Even her allies felt the tension. Those who had once served her with unwavering loyalty now questioned the limits of her ambition. Could anyone survive her wrath? And if so, at what cost? The fear she generated was not merely external, it penetrated the hearts of those closest to her, ensuring compliance and obedience without the need for constant supervision. Her presence, even when absent, was a force that shaped behavior, guided decisions, and silenced potential dissent before it could manifest. By the conclusion of her first large-scale operation, the Iron Duchess had not only neutralized her enemies, but had reshaped the kingdom itself. Territories once divided and warring now moved with caution, measured every action against the possibility of her unseen influence. The massacre had been more than a demonstration of force. It had been a psychological blueprint, a model of control that left both enemies and allies aware that her vengeance was not merely a response to betrayal, but a force capable of redefining the political landscape entirely. And yet, this was only the beginning of her orchestrated campaign. The full extent of her vengeance was still unfolding, with even darker measures yet to be revealed. Even the most steadfast supporters of the Iron Duchess began to sense a shift that no strategy could mask. The massacre had been precise, calculated, and effective, yet something had changed in her demeanor, her methods, and the very energy that radiated from her. Allies who had once felt secure now walked through her halls like strangers navigating a labyrinth of fear. They saw her in council chambers, silent, her gaze lingering on faces with an intensity that made even the loyal tremble. What had been admiration slowly became unease, and unease became whispered questions. Had she crossed a line that could no longer be reconciled with reason? The rupture was subtle at first. Advisors missed meetings, explanations came late, messages contained hesitation, previously unseen. Yet the Duchess noticed everything. She did not confront openly. Confrontation was unnecessary. The shift in loyalty, the subtle hesitation in voice, the micro-expressions of doubt, these were sufficient signals. Her allies realized that her vengeance had evolved from precise retribution to something almost uncontainable. Even those who had believed themselves untouchable began to calculate their words, their actions, their very presence in her court. Rumors began to circulate, not of rebellion, but of an internal fear that no title or wealth could mitigate. Couriers and servants whispered about the changes in her routines, the sudden disappearance of familiar faces, the arrival of unknown figures with secret messages. The Iron Duchess had created an atmosphere where every move was observed, and even the smallest lapse could carry consequences they were not prepared to face. Allies questioned not only the safety of their positions, but the very morality of the campaign they had supported. She exploited this tension with meticulous awareness. By allowing doubt and fear to spread naturally, the Duchess ensured that no direct confrontation was necessary. Allies began to second-guess each other, to weigh decisions carefully, and to hesitate where previously they had acted with certainty. The fissures in loyalty created a network of uncertainty, far more potent than any army or explicit threat. Each hesitation, each whisper, each suspicious glance became another thread in the web she had spun, a silent confirmation that her vengeance had exceeded expectations and terrors alike. As the tension escalated, she orchestrated public and private actions to reinforce her dominance. An estate left untouched became a symbol of her favor. A council member's sudden disappearance, unexplained but noted, became a warning. She allowed small victories and subtle punishments to play out in ways that amplified fear without overt violence, proving to her allies that their comprehension of her limits was dangerously flawed. The line between loyalty and betrayal became impossible to discern, and by the time they realized it, her influence had tightened like a vice. And yet, the most chilling aspect of this rupture was not the fear itself, but the realization among her allies that the Iron Duchess had become unpredictable even to those closest to her. They could anticipate strategy, but not intent. They could observe movements, but not motivation. In their hearts, they understood that she had crossed a threshold where even support carried risk, and trust had become a delicate, dangerous commodity. Now I want to hear from you. Could you imagine following someone whose power is so absolute that loyalty itself becomes a peril? Comment below and share your thoughts on this chilling shift. What would you do if the person you trusted most became the architect of your fear? Your perspective is part of unraveling this story of strategy, psychology, and vengeance. Even the Iron Duchess, for all her cunning and calculated cruelty, was not immune to the consequences of her own relentless pursuit of vengeance. The more she dismantled her enemies, manipulated her allies, and extended the reach of her underground network, the more fragile the foundations of her power became. Regions that had once moved in quiet compliance now trembled under the weight of accumulated fear. The structures she had carefully built, alliances, loyalties, networks, began to crack as those closest to her felt the strain of living under a ruler whose wrath was both invisible and inexorably inevitable. The first signs appeared in minor rebellions, a mismanaged harvest, an abandoned estate, whispers of nobles secretly fleeing the court. These were small ripples, easily dismissed by those who had survived her earlier machinations, yet they indicated a subtle, systemic failure. Where she had once commanded obedience through uncertainty and fear, now there were pockets of resistance growing quietly, fueled by the knowledge that her attention was finite, that even the most meticulous plan could not encompass every corner of her expanding dominion. Allies began to desert subtly, their departures almost imperceptible. A trusted advisor fell ill in circumstances suspicious enough to question but too ambiguous to confront. Messengers took alternate routes, avoiding her gaze, delivering news only partially accurate or delayed. Every deviation became an indicator of weakness in the iron grip she had maintained, and the Duchess, acutely aware of these shifts, began to reassess her strategies. Her revenge, once a precise instrument, now required adaptation to the unforeseen fractures that emerged from its own weight. The psychological toll was not limited to her allies. Even the survivors of her earlier massacres and punishments, nobles who had once lived under her silent intimidation, found ways to resist, subtle acts that undermined her, authority without direct confrontation. Unobserved sabotage, secret alliances, and small rebellions combined into a mosaic of instability that threatened the very order she had imposed. The kingdom itself became a chessboard where every move was countered in ways she had not fully anticipated, and yet she continued, adapting, recalculating, turning even these fissures into instruments of further manipulation. The Duchess's own psyche began to reflect the isolation that came with absolute power. The very force she wielded so effectively, the invisible network, the fear, the silent punishments, created an environment in which she could trust no one, not even herself. Allies became potential threats. Enemies were omnipresent in thought, and every decision carried a weight that threatened to fracture her judgment. Power, she realized, came at a cost that extended beyond the political. It exacted a toll on the mind, a constant vigilance that eroded human connection and replaced it with strategy as the primary mode of survival. By the end of the first year following her mass reprisals, the kingdom had shifted irreversibly. The Iron Duchess had neutralized opposition and instilled obedience, yet the cost of her vengeance was visible in every aspect of governance. Provinces suffered under her relentless oversight, minor officials collapsed under stress, and whispers of revolt, however small, reminded her that absolute control was an illusion. Her enemies were not only defeated, they had become mirrors reflecting the potential fragility of her own empire, and the Duchess understood, perhaps better than anyone, that every act of vengeance left an echo that could return in unpredictable ways. Over time, the story of the Iron Duchess became less about specific events and more about the legend she had forged. Chronicles, letters, and whispered tales blended together, creating a narrative that was as much myth as reality. Yet, beneath the embellishment, the truth remained. Clear, she had transformed the understanding of power and vengeance within the kingdom. Her actions, while undeniably brutal, had set precedents that shaped behavior for generations, both among allies who survived and enemies who plotted in shadows. The name Iron Duchess carried a weight that was impossible to ignore, an embodiment of strategic ruthlessness intertwined with an almost supernatural perception of human weakness. Her dark legacy was multifaceted. Politically, she demonstrated that authority need not rely solely on armies, proclamations, or overt demonstrations of strength. Instead, she revealed the efficacy of psychological dominance, the kind that destabilizes opponents before any physical confrontation occurs. Nobles began to measure their words, servants reported minor infractions that might otherwise have gone unnoticed, and the subtle influence of fear became as important as any weapon or treasury in the land. The Duchess had codified terror into governance, teaching future generations that survival depended not only on loyalty, but on anticipating the unseen hand that could dismantle them without warning. Socially, her reign left a scar that extended beyond the noble court. Families of former opponents whispered cautionary tales to their children, instilling a culture of vigilance and obedience. Artists and storytellers captured her image in paintings, plays, and ballads, each adding layers of drama, cruelty, and fascination. The Iron Duchess became both a warning and a fascination, a symbol of what could happen when intelligence, vengeance, and patience combined in one individual. The stories blurred the line between admiration and fear, creating a legend that inspired both awe and trepidation. Yet her personal legacy was perhaps the most paradoxical. Allies who survived her purges and machinations respected her cunning, yet they lived with the tension that comes from serving someone capable of unpredictable wrath. Enemies who had fled or survived her subtle punishments carried trauma that echoed through generations, while observers and chroniclers debated the moral dimensions of her rule. Was she a tyrant? A genius? A cautionary tale of vengeance's consuming power? The truth was a complex amalgam, impossible to fully separate from the shadowed aura she had cultivated. The Iron Duchess's influence did not fade with her passing. Her strategies were studied, adapted, and occasionally emulated by rulers who sought to wield control without relying solely on brute force. Her legend persisted in secret councils, whispered meetings, and clandestine correspondences, where her methods served as both template and warning. Historians noted that she had changed the very fabric of power, demonstrating that a ruler could be as formidable through subtlety and fear as through armies and titles. Her legacy was dark, undeniable, and instructive, a testament to the enduring influence of intelligence wielded without compassion. As you reflect on this, consider the complexity of her reign. A woman whose vengeance reshaped an entire kingdom, whose strategy extended beyond sight and comprehension, and whose legend endured far longer than any single act of violence. The Iron Duchess did more than punish. She redefined power itself, leaving a shadow that stretched across time. Her story reminds us that history is shaped not only by battles and victories, but by the invisible currents of fear, strategy, and human psychology that few can anticipate or survive. Even after years of observing her empire, studying the subtle movements of her allies and enemies, the Iron Duchess had one final act that would define her legacy. This was not an act of mass destruction or immediate terror, but a revelation so profound that it reframed every previous action she had taken. It was whispered that in the final council meeting of her reign, she presented a document, a ledger, or perhaps a secret letter. No one ever agreed on its contents, that revealed the intricate architecture of her vengeance. The details exposed how meticulously she had orchestrated each disappearance, manipulated each ally, and anticipated every act of defiance. For the first time, those who had survived her reign glimpsed the full extent of her strategy, and the realization sent shockwaves through the kingdom. This revelation confirmed what historians had long suspected. The Iron Duchess had never acted impulsively. Every massacre, every subtle threat, every silent execution had been a piece of a larger design, a psychological chessboard where she was always several moves ahead. Allies who had feared her unpredictability now understood the precision behind her chaos. Enemies who had survived learned that even their apparent freedom was an illusion carefully crafted by a mind attuned to human behavior, loyalty, and the inevitability of fear. Yet even with this revelation, the Duchess did not offer absolution or closure. Instead, she left her court with the understanding that power, when wielded without hesitation and with complete control over both seen and unseen forces, could bend the will of entire regions. Her enemies, former allies, and observers alike recognized that her influence had extended beyond life or death. It had reshaped the political, social, and psychological landscape of the kingdom in ways no one could fully undo. Her vengeance, precise and invisible for so long, had reached its apex. And it is in this final act that we see the duality of her legacy. Terrifying, yet mesmerizing, cruel, yet astonishingly intelligent. The Iron Duchess taught that ultimate power is not measured solely by armies or conquests, but by the ability to manipulate perception, orchestrate fear, and foresee human reactions with uncanny clarity. Even centuries later, her name evokes a sense of awe, a chilling reminder that strategy, patience, and psychological mastery can outweigh brute force. If you've followed this journey through her life, her strategy, and her vengeance, take a moment to reflect on the magnitude of her actions. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end," to share your reaction and engage with others who are exploring this shadowed history. Don't forget to like this video if it gave you new insights into power and strategy, and make sure you're subscribed to continue exploring stories like this. There's a video right next to this one that complements these lessons on power and intrigue. Click and continue with me over there to uncover even more secrets of the past that shaped the present.